Hey, what's up, you guys? Yes. So, the coveted chapter 7 of Crime and Punishment. Actually, wait. Oops. Wait. I can't find. Okay. The coveted chapter 7 of Crime and Punishment. As before, the door opened a tiny crack, and as before, two sharp and distressful eyes stared at him from the darkness. Then Raskolnikov lost his head and almost made a big mistake, assuming that the old woman would be afraid of their being alone, and without much confidence that his appearance would reassure her. He grabbed the door and pulled it toward him to prevent her from closing it again. Seeing this, she did not pull the door back toward her, but she did not let go of the knob either, and he almost dragged her out onto the stairs clinging to the door. When he realized, however, that she was blocking the entrance and would not let him in, he went right up to her. She hopped back in panic, tried to say something, but seemed unable to. She looked at him with eyes wide open. I'm reading! Hello, Iona Ivanova, he began as casually as he could, but his voice would not obey him, broke off and trembled. I've brought you something. Come, maybe we better go over here to the light. He brushed straight by her and walked uninvited into the room. The old woman rushed in after him. Her tongue loosened up now. Good God! What are you up to? Who are you anyway? What do you want? I'm actually reading the book. Please, Iona Ivanova, you know me. I'm Raskolnikov. Stop! 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 You can't shake my car! You cannot shake my car! You cannot do that! You literally cannot do that.
What do you mean I can? I just did. Can I have a hug now?
You cannot shake my car.
I can.
You cannot do that.
I did though. Can I have a hug?
I'm gonna tell my dad. I'll tell my dad that you did.
What?
That you shake the car!
That's balding and stupid.
Please, Iona Ivanova, you know me. I'm Raskolnikov. Here, I brought the pledge. I said I would the other day, and he held out the pledge to her. The old woman threw a quick glance at the pledge, then immediately fixed her eyes straight onto the eyes of her uninvited visitor. She stared intensely, angrily, and suspiciously. A minute passed. He thought he saw something like mockery in her eyes, as though she already knew everything. He felt himself losing his grip, and he felt scared. I locked all the doors! You can't get in! He felt himself losing his grip, and he felt scared. So scared that if she went on staring at him like that, if she went another half minute without saying a word, he would have run away. Why are you staring at me as though you didn't know who I was? He said suddenly, even with a note of anger. If you want it, take it. If you don't, I'll go somewhere else. I don't have much time. He had not even thought about saying this. Somehow it was said of itself, just like that. The old woman remembered. Her visitor's firm tone seemed to encourage her. But why all so sudden, my good man? What is it, anyway? She said, glancing at the pledge. It's a silver cigarette case, I told you before. She held out her hand. But why are you so pale? Look at your hands shake. Have you been at the baths or what? Fever, he said abruptly. You can't help looking pale if you don't get enough to eat, he added, scarcely enunciating the words. His strength was failing him again, yet his answer seemed reasonable. The old woman took the package. She looked at Raskolnikov intently and weighed the pledge in her hand. What is it? She asked. The thing, it's a cigarette case, silver. Take a look. Doesn't seem like silver, somehow. You certainly wrapped it up. Trying to untie the knot, she turned to the light that came from the window. In spite of the closeness, the windows were all shut. For a few seconds, she had her back turned toward him. He unbuttoned his overcoat and freed the axe from the sling. He still did not draw it out all the way. He merely held it under the coat with his right hand. His hands were terribly weak. He could feel them becoming stiffer, and he numbered every moment. He was afraid he would drop the axe, and suddenly his head seemed to whirl. He certainly did a job of wrapping it up, the old woman exclaimed indignantly, and made a movement as though she were about to turn to him. There was not a moment to lose. He drew the axe out all the way, raised it back with both hands, hardly aware of what he was doing, and almost without effort, almost automatically, he brought the blunt side down on her head. He seemed to have no strength, yet the moment he started bringing the axe down, strength sprang up in him. The old woman was bareheaded as usual. Her thin, light, gray-streaked hair, as usual greasy and streaked with oil, was in a rat's tail plait, fastened under what was left of a broken horn comb that stuck out at the nape of her neck. She was small, and the blow had struck her on the very crown of her head. She had cried out, but quite feebly. Then she suddenly sank in a heap on the floor, though first she managed to raise both hands to her head. In one hand she still held the pledge. He struck once more, then again, full strength, with the blunt side of the axe, and on top of her head. The blood gushed as from an overturned glass, and the body fell backward. He stepped back to let her fall, and immediately bent over her face. She was dead. Her eyes were staring as if they wanted to leap out. Her forehead and her whole face were terribly contorted and drawn by a convulsion. He laid the axe beside the dead woman on the floor. At once he felt in her pocket, taking care to avoid the flowing blood, that same right pocket from which he had seen her take the keys last time. The dark spots and the spinning of his head no longer troubled him. He was in full possession of his mind, yet his hands trembled. He remembered later that he was particularly cautious and alert, and tried not to get himself smeared. Then he took out the keys. As they had been before, they were all on one chain, on one steel ring. He ran immediately into the bedroom with them. It was a very small room with a huge icon case. By the far wall stood a large clean bed with a silk patchwork quilt. Against the third wall was a bureau. Strange. As soon as he tried fitting the keys to the bureau drawers, as soon as he heard the jingling of the keys, something like a spasm passed over him. Suddenly he wanted to abandon everything and leave. This was only for a moment. It was too late to leave. He was even beginning to laugh at himself when another alarming thought suddenly struck him. He suddenly began to imagine that the old woman was still alive and might actually come to. Abandoning the keys and bureau, he ran back to the body, seized the axe, and lifted it once more over the old woman. But he did not let it fall. There could be no doubt she was dead. He bent down and examined her more closely. He saw clearly that the skull was fractured and even slightly battered in on one side. He wanted to feel it with his finger, but then withdrew his hand quickly. It was clear enough as it was. Meanwhile, a whole pool of blood had formed on the floor. He suddenly noticed a string on the old woman's neck and pulled at it, but the string was sturdy and did not break, and it was wet with blood. He tried pulling what was attached to it out from the bosom of her dress, but something got in the way and it stuck. In his impatience, he lifted the axe again to break the string on the body, and there from above, but he did not dare. With difficulty getting his hands and axe all blood-smeared, he cut the string after 2 minutes' harried effort and removed it without touching the axe to the body. He had not been wrong. There was a purse. On the string were 2 crosses, one of cypress wood and one of brass, and there was an enameled icon in addition. Along with these hung a small greasy suede purse with a steel rim and ring. The purse was crammed full. Without looking at it, Raskolnikov stuffed it in his pocket, dropped the crosses on the old woman's chest, taking the axe with him this time, rushed back to the bedroom. He was in a terrible hurry, snatched at the keys, and again began trying them. Somehow none of them worked. They would not fit the locks. Not only were his hands shaking, he kept making mistakes. For example, he would see that a key was not the right one, that it would not fit, yet he insisted on trying it. Suddenly he remembered that the big key with the deep notch, dangling there along with the small ones, could not possibly belong to the bureau. This had even occurred to him before, but must belong to a strong-box of some sort, and perhaps in that very strong-box everything lay hidden. Knowing that old women usually keep strong boxes under their beds, he abandoned the bureau and began to feel under the bed. So it was. There was a good-sized chest, about a yard long with a curved top, surfaced and red leather, studded with steel nails. The notched key fitted at once, and the chest opened. On top, under a white sheet, lay a hareskin coat trimmed with red brocade. Under it was a silk dress, and then a shawl, and then below that it seemed there were only odds and ends of clothes. First he tried to wipe his blood-stained hands on the red brocade. "It's red!" he reckoned. "Blood will be less noticeable on red." And suddenly he remembered himself and thought in a panic, "Good Lord, am I going out of my mind or what?" But as he was shuffling through the odds and ends, a gold watch slipped out from under the fur coat. He started going through everything. Sure enough, some gold objects were scattered along the clothes. All pledges, probably, redeemed and unredeemed, bracelets, chains, earrings, brooches, and similar items. Some were in cases, others simply wrapped in newspaper, but neatly and carefully folded in double sheets and tied around with tape. He began to cram them hurriedly into the pockets of his trousers and coat without examining or opening the packets or cases, but he did not manage to take many. Suddenly he heard someone walking in the room where the old woman was. He froze and remained still as death. Everything was quiet. He must have imagined it. Suddenly he distinctly heard a soft cry, as though someone softly and abruptly moaned, then fell silent. And then for a minute or two, there was a deathly silence once more. He crouched by the strong box waiting, scarcely breathing. Then he leaped out suddenly, seized the axe, and ran out of the bedroom. Lizaveta was standing in the middle of the room with a large bundle in her arms, staring stupefied at her murdered sister, white as a sheet and unable to cry out. She saw him as he ran out and trembled like a leaf, small, shuddering twitches crisscrossing her whole face. She raised an arm and opened her mouth, but did not cry out. Slowly she started backing away from him into a corner, staring at him steadily and persistently, but not screaming, as though she had no breath left with which to cry out. He rushed at her with the axe. Her mouth was twisted pathetically out of shape, in the manner of very small children who are getting ready to be afraid of something, who keep staring steadily at the object of their fear as they are about to cry out. And this unfortunate Lizaveta was so simple and squashed and absolutely afraid, she did not even raise her arms to protect her face, although at the moment that would have been the most natural and inevitable gesture, since the axe was raised directly over her face. All she did was lift her free left hand a little at a distance from her face, slowly stretching it out toward him, as though to keep him off. The sharp end of the axe struck her directly in the skull, splitting instantly the whole upper part of her forehead, almost as far as the crown. She collapsed. Raskolnikov nearly lost control of himself. He seized her bundle, threw it down again, and ran into the anteroom. Panic was taking hold of him more and more, especially after this, the second and quite unexpected murder. He wanted to run away from there as quickly as possible. If at that moment he had been in the condition to choose rationally or see more clearly, if he could even imagine all the difficulties of his situation, how altogether desperate, hideous, and absurd it was, and if at the same time he could have grasped how many difficulties he would have to overcome, how many villainies he might perhaps still have to commit, in order to get out of there, in order to get himself as far as home, quite likely he would have abandoned everything and gone immediately to give himself up. And not because he was afraid for himself, but entirely from horror and disgust for what he had done. Disgust especially surged up within him and grew stronger every minute. For nothing in the world would he now have gone back to the strongbox or even into those rooms. Little by little, a kind of absent-mindedness, even a kind of reverie, began to take hold of him. He forgot himself for minutes on end, or rather, he forgot what was important and fastened on little things. Looking into the kitchen, he saw half a bucket of water on the bench and decided to wash his hands in the axe. His hands were sticky with blood. He immersed the axe blade in the water, grabbed a piece of soap that was lying on the windowsill on a broken dish, and started washing his hands right in the bucket. When he had washed them, he took out the axe and washed the blade. It took him a long time, about 3 minutes, to wash off the wood where it was bloodstained. Excuse me. Then he wiped it with a piece of laundry drying on the clothesline that stretched through the kitchen. Then he took the axe to the window and examined it carefully. There were no traces left, though the wood was still wet. He carefully inserted the axe into the sling under his coat, as much as light permitted in that dim kitchen. He then examined coat, trousers, shoes. From outside, and at first glance, there seemed to be nothing. Only on the shoes there was a stain. He moistened the rag and washed off the shoes. He had a feeling, though, that his examination had not been thorough, and there might be something he had not noticed that actually flaunted itself to the eye. He paused in the middle of the room, absorbed in his thoughts. A dark, tormented thought swelled up within him. The thought that he was going out of his mind, and at that moment he lacked the capacity to make a rational choice or protect himself, and that perhaps something quite different needed to be done from what he was actually doing. "Good God, I gotta run!" he muttered, and hurried into the anteroom. But in the anteroom a horror awaited him the like of which he had never experienced before. He stood there, looked, and he could not believe his eyes. The outside door from the anteroom to the stairs, the very door where he had stood ringing the bell not long ago, the door through which he had entered, stood unfastened and a hand's length open. At that time it had been neither locked nor fastened. The whole time! The whole woman, perhaps out of caution, had not fastened it behind him. But, good God! He had seen Lizaveta after that, and how it had not occurred to him that she must have come in from somewhere. Certainly not through the wall. He dashed to the door and fastened the latch. But no, again, that's not it. I've got to get out of here, to get out. He removed the latch, opened the door a little, and listened at the stairs. He listened a long time. Somewhere far below, probably at the gateway, two voices were shouting something, loudly and shrilly, arguing, quarreling. What is that? He waited patiently. Things quieted down all at once. As though cut short, they had gone. He was about to leave now, but suddenly a door was flung noisily open on the floor below, and somebody went down the stairs humming a tune. Why do they all have to make so much noise? Flashed into his head. He closed the door again and waited. At last everything fell silent. There was not a breath. He had already taken a step onto the stairs when suddenly he heard a new set of footsteps. Far, far far, far off, he heard these footsteps at the very bottom of the stairs. But later he clearly remembered that from the first sound he heard, he began for some reason to suspect that these footsteps moved inevitably there, to the 4th floor, to the old woman's. Why? What was so special about them? The footsteps were heavy, steady, unhurried. He now paused the 1st floor, still climbing, more and more distinctly audible. He could hear the heavy breath of the man who approached, on his way to the 3rd floor now. This way! Raskolnikov suddenly felt turned to stone, as if in a dream where you dream you're being pursued. They are getting close. They intend to kill you. Stand rooted to the spot, unable to move your arms. At last, when the visitor was beginning to mount to the 4th floor, he gave a violent start and somehow managed to swiftly and skillfully slither back from the landing into the apartment and close the door behind him. Then quietly, inaudibly, he grasped the latch and slipped it into place. His instinct helped him. He crouched breathlessly right by the door. The uninvited visitor was also at the door by then. They stood now opposite the other, as he and the old woman had recently been standing when the door alone separated them. But now he was doing the intent listening. The visitor man panted heavily several times. He must be a big, stout man, Raskolnikov thought, clenching the axe. It all seemed as though he were dreaming it. The visitor seized the bell and rang hard. As soon as the bell rang, he heard the tinny sound. Raskolnikov suddenly had the feeling What? That's my windshield wiper. I don't know you.
Galahad. Come on.
First of all, I drive here. Then you scream at me because apparently I went the wrong way.
Yeah, 'cause you drove like a
Then you
retard.
slam and then you say I drive like an R slur. Okay, great.
Have a hug.
And then you slam the door.
I
Because I tell-
apologize. I apologize. Have a hug.
Well, it's going to take me some time to accept your apology.
Have a hug. I can't hear you. I'm deaf.
At last, actually, where it is. Put my windshield wipers back! Please! I don't know you!
Can I have a hug?
I don't know you!
Yes, you do. We've been together for 2 years.
That's
Have
my
a
purse! I don't know you!
hug. Have a hug. One hug, please. I'll go away if you do. Next is your gas tank.
As soon as you have to open the door.
What? I can't hear you.
As soon as the bell rang and he heard the tinny sound, Raskolnikov suddenly had the feeling that something in the room was moving around. It doesn't open! Stop it!
Can I have a hug?
As soon as the bell rang and he heard the tinny sound, Raskolnikov suddenly had the feeling that something in the room was moving around. For a few seconds, he even... Stop! Put my windshield wipers back! Stop! Put them back!
Hug me.
Put them back! Put them back!
Hug me.
Put them back! Put them back!
Can I have a hug? Please.
For a few seconds, he even listened quite seriously. The stranger rang again, went on waiting, but then suddenly in his impatience began to shake the doorknob with all his strength. Raskolnikov looked in horror at the hook of the latch hopping about in its place and waited in blank panic for the moment that the latch would leap out. The door was being so powerfully shaken, it seemed really possible. He thought of holding the latch with his hand, but then he might guess. Once again, his head started to spin. I'm going to faint, he thought in a flash, but the stranger started speaking, and he immediately recovered himself. What the hell's going on here? They snoring away or somebody strangled them, he roared in a booming voice. Hey, Yona Ivanova, you old witch! Lizaveta, you fabulous beauty! Open up! Oof! Hell, they asleep or what? And then again, enraged, he pulled at the bell with all his might about a dozen times. He certainly seemed to be a man of authority and at home in his house. At that very moment, though, Raskolnikov did not hear them at first. There were light, hurried footsteps on the stairs. Somebody else was approaching. Nobody home, the newcomer shouted gaily and resonantly, going straight up to the first visitor, who was still pulling on the bell. Hello, coach. He must be quite young, judging by the voice, Raskolnikov thought. Who knows? I damn near broke the lock, Coach answered. How come you knew my name? Aha! Well, the day before yesterday at Grambinas, I beat you at billiards 3 times in a row. Oh! So they're not in? Strange. Dumb, what's more. Terrible. Nuisance. Where would the old woman go? I've got business. Well, I've got business too, my good man. Well, what's to be done? Means back. Eek! But I thought I'd get some money, the old man cried out. Sure, that means I have to come back. But why did she make the appointment? She made my appointment herself, the witch. It's out of my way. And how she manages to go gallivanting off to some bloody devil, I'm sure I don't know. All year long she sits home, the witch. She mopes, her feet hurt. Now all of a sudden she goes out on a stroll. Maybe we should ask the janitor. What? Where she went and when she's coming back. Ask hell. She doesn't go anywhere, though. Once again, he pulled at the knob. What the hell can we do? Let's be on our way. Wait a minute, the young man suddenly exclaimed. Look, see what the door opens when you pull on it. So? That means it's not locked. It's on the latch. On the hook, that is. Do you hear how the latch rattles? So? Don't you get it? That means somebody's home. If nobody was home, they'd lock the door from outside with a lock. With a key, not the latch from the inside. Hear how the latch rattles? To lock the door on the latch from the inside, somebody's got to be home. Understand? It means they're sitting at home and not opening up. God damn, if you're not right, the astonished coach cried out. What the hell are they up to? He began furiously shaking the door. Wait, the young man called again. Wait a minute. Something's wrong here. You rang and beat at the door. They don't open. That means they either both passed out or what. I tell you what. Let's go to the janitor. Let him wake them up. Right. They started making their way down. Wait a minute, you better stay here. I'll run down and get the janitor. Why should I stay? Better, Ed, if you said so. You see, I'm going to be a public investigator. It's obvious, it's so obvious that something is wrong here, the young man exclaimed heatedly, and rushed hastily down the stairs. Coach remained. He pulled the bell again, softly this time. It gave a single ring. Then quietly, as though he were inspecting it and thinking deep thoughts, he started turning the doorknob, twisting it and letting it go as though to convince himself all over again that the door was only on the latch. Then panting, he bent down and started looking through the keyhole. But the key was in it on the inside, and he could see nothing. Raskolnikov stood there, clenching his axe. He was in kind of a delirium. Isaac reference. He was even ready to tangle with them the moment they stepped in. While they were knocking at the door and talking together, he even thought several times of putting an end to it all, yelling out all at once from behind the door. At times he wanted to start swearing at them, taunting them until they opened it. Get it over with, flashed through his mind. What the devil? What the devil doing in there? Time passed. A minute. Another. No one came. Coach started shuffling about. Suddenly, he cried out impatiently, He is a devil, though! Abandoning his post, he too made his way downstairs, hurrying along, clopping on the stairs with his shoes. His footsteps passed down into silence. Lord, what is to be done? Raskolnikov removed the latch and opened the door. He could hear nothing. Suddenly, without thinking about it, he left. As securely as possible, he closed the door behind him and plunged down the stairs. When he had already gone 2 flights of stairs, he suddenly heard a great commotion below. Where could he hide? There was no place to conceal himself. He was about to run back up to the apartment. Hey, you bastard, you goblin, you devil, hold up there! With a yell, someone burst out of one of the apartments below, and not only ran, but practically fell downstairs, shouting loudly, Mitka, 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 Mitka! You fool, blast you! Excuse me. The shout ended in a yelp. The last sounds already came from the yard. Everything quieted down. At that very moment, however, several men, speaking to each other loudly and at frequent intervals, started climbing the stairs noisily. There were 3 or 4. He could distinguish the resonant voice of the young man. It's them! In sheer despair, he walked straight towards them. If they stopped him, all was lost. If they let him by, all was still lost. They would remember him. They were approaching each other. There was only 1 flight of stairs between them, and suddenly, rescue! A few steps away, on the right, empty and wide open, was the apartment, that very same apartment on the 2nd floor that the workmen had been painting, and which they had now left, as though on purpose. It must have been they who had just run out with all that shouting. The floor was freshly painted. In the middle of one room stood a small tub and a crock with paint and a brush. He darted through the open door in a flash and hid himself against the wall, and just in time. They were already on that very landing. Then they walked up and past to the 4th floor, talking loudly. He waited, went out on tiptoe, and ran down. There was no one on the stairs or at the gateway. Swiftly he passed through the gates and turned to the left along the street. He knew most excellently well, that at this moment they were already in the apartment, that they were astonished to find it open since it had been closed but a little while before. They were already looking at the bodies, and that not more than a minute would pass before they fully grasped that the murderer had just been there. What are you doing?
Julia, please, come on. You're wasting my fucking fucking time.
You know what wasted my time when you yelled at me for no reason. I have a page and a half left.
Juliet,
And you know what? I haven't forgiven you yet, so just give me some time to forgive you.
if you don't come out right now, I'm going home. Seriously?
I need
5
time.
seconds.
I need time to forgive you.
Juliet, I promise you I'll go home. You have 5 seconds to decide. 1, 2, 3.
Will you fix my windshield wipers?
If you come right here, give me a hug.
Can I give you a hug, then finish my freaking chapter?
What?
Can I give you a hug and then finish the chapter?
Yes. Now, can we make
God!
I'm gonna stop you. I'm sorry, I'm gonna tell you.
Okay, so. Fix my windshield wipers, please! Oh my God. He knew very well, he knew most excellently well, that at this moment they were already in the apartment, that they were astonished to find it open since it had been closed but a little while before, that they were already looking at the bodies, and that not more than a minute would pass before they fully grasped that the murderer had just been there and had managed to conceal himself somewhere, slither past them, and escape. They would also grasp that he had also been trapped in the vacant apartment as they were ascending the stairs. Meanwhile, he dared not quicken his pace in any way, though he still had about 100 steps before the first turning. Shouldn't I slip in some gate and wait on the stairs somewhere until it all dies down? No, that's bad. Shouldn't I throw the axe somewhere? Shouldn't I take a cab? No, that's bad. Bad! At last he reached Stolenary Place. Half dead, he turned into it. Here he was almost safe, and he knew it. There would be fewer suspicious about his presence here. The crowd was thick, and he lost himself in it like a grain of sand. All his torments had weakened him so much, however, that he could scarcely move. The sweat rolled off him in drops, and his neck was soaked. As he came out onto the, back of the canal, someone shouted at him, "You've sure had it, brother!" He hardly knew what he was doing himself now, and the further he went, the worse it got. He did remember, though, suddenly coming out onto the canal bank, feeling scared there were so few people here, and he might therefore be conspicuous, and wanted to turn back to Stolenary Place. In spite of the fact he had almost collapsed, he made a detour and arrived home from a different direction. Nor was he in full command of himself as he went through the gate of the house. At any rate, he was already as far as the stairs before he remembered the axe, and yet he was confronted with a very important problem. How to put it back while attracting the least possible attention. He was no longer capable, of course, of appreciating that it might be much better of him to not put the axe back in its former place at all, but to dump it down somewhere quietly in somebody else's backyard, later if necessary. Everything turned out well, though. The door to the janitor's room was closed but not locked, which would make it seem likely the janitor was in. Yet he had so far lost his capacity to take such things into account that he walked straight up to the janitor's door and flung it open. If the janitor had asked, "What do you want?" he would have been quite capable of simply handing him the axe. Once again, however, the janitor was not in, and he managed to put the axe where it had been before under the bench. He had even hidden it with a lock, as it had been partly hidden before. From that time until he reached his own room, he met no one, not a solitary soul. The landlady's door was closed. He went into his room and threw himself down on the couch just as he was. He did not sleep, but lay there in a state of oblivion. Had anybody entered his room, he would have leaped up immediately and cried out. Fragments and shreds of thoughts swarmed his head, but he could not get a hold of a single one. He could not linger over a single one in spite of all his trying. And that was chapter 7. That was part 1, chapter 7 of Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. So part 2, period. Like, it's gonna get more interesting later, so yeah.